Newspaper Thief is a pretty enjoyable Looney Tunes show episode. This is the 14th episode of the first season, and I rather enjoyed the concept, but it was a little bit slow to get going. But once it did, I'd say after about the first third, it became really good fun. And this focuses on the fact that Daffy is accusing everybody in the neighbourhood for stealing his newspaper. And of course, the big question is, who has stolen his newspaper? And at the moment, I won't reveal who was responsible, but I will, with a spoiler warning, at the end talk about it and how I feel about the outcome. And Daffy's plan is to gather everybody in the neighbourhood over for dinner to then interrogate them to get whoever it was to confess. And that means we have loads of other characters. We have Gossamer and Witch Lezah, Granny and Yosemite Sam. I loved Granny in this in particular. I thought she was delightful. And it's a really fun concept and a pretty decent execution. I loved how cool and calm Bugs was throughout it, while Daffy was getting increasingly frustrated because nobody was telling him the truth. And I thought it worked really, really well. As I said, a little bit slow to begin with, but once it got going, I found that it moved steadily forward at a really good rate, and I rather liked the final outcome. And it's very, very well animated, of course. We do have a lot of it set in Bugs and Daffy's house, but beyond that, we do have a few other locations. We get to see this float that Daffy is making. He's making it out of the newspapers, and it looks rather great, and probably exactly what one would expect a Daffy Duck float to look like. So there are several things to look at, things in the animation to keep it interesting, and ultimately, the quest of finding out who is taking the newspaper definitely had me hooked. I was very keen to find out, and I will now explain who was responsible. So this is a huge, huge spoiler for the reveal. And I will say I loved Bugs's reaction when he found out, because it turns out that the person who has prevented the newspapers from reaching Daffy is indeed Daffy Duck. He forgot to renew his subscription to the newspaper, and so they just stopped being delivered. Nobody was taking them at all. Had I been in a different mood, I might have thought that felt like a cop-out. It didn't feel like a way to conclude that part of the story, because the mystery was no longer a mystery, not because it was resolved, but because Daffy had been misguided. So if anybody watches this and thinks actually that's not a great way to conclude the story, I think if I were in a different mood, I'd completely agree. But actually, because it was a strong element of surprise, really wasn't expecting it, and with Bugs's reaction to it as well, I actually quite enjoyed it. So I rather liked that, and absolutely did not see it coming. So I found that to be pretty interesting. But yes, if there's an argument for the fact that it feels like cheating somebody out of a satisfying resolution, then I could understand. But personally, I quite liked it. And as an episode as a whole, I rather liked Newspaper Thief. If you're a fan of Looney Tunes or Bugs or Daffy and you haven't seen it, definitely recommend checking it out.